Welcome to part 2 of my 2-part video series dealing with the popular atheist trope, there is no evidence for God. Now, often atheists will use the claim there is no evidence for God as justification for a professed position of a lack of belief in God. They will present this as an indication of great intellectual humility.
It is, though.
Is he mocking us?
Of course he's mocking us.
As we sit here mocking him, I'm like, I feign offended. Is he mocking us?
There being no evidence for God is justification for a lack of belief in God. I don't know why he's got to shit on this entire idea. I mean, the fact that you don't have any evidence to suggest a God exists is a good enough reason to not believe in a God. And I would say that it is a sign of great intellectual humility because you're admitting that you just don't believe in a God. Like, there are Gnostic atheists out there that say they know God doesn't exist, and I would say that they carry the same burden of proof as anybody that believes that God exists or claims to know that God exists.
In the absence of evidence that would sway them one way or the other, they simply abstain from judgment on the matter of God's existence.
No, I don't think that we do.
Well, no, we don't. It's actually in the sight of evidence that swayed somebody else to God that isn't good enough for us that we don't consider it evidence. Like, that's what he's describing here is that
I think what he's describing is an agnostic atheist, because an agnostic atheist would say there is no evidence for God. I don't believe in a God, and your lack of evidence, it has not convinced me that there is one. However, I don't know for sure that there isn't one. So I think that may be what he's saying, abstain from judgment on the matter of existence. I think they're saying I don't believe there's a God because I haven't seen enough evidence to prove that there is one.
Right. I would agree that this is describing a agnostic atheist. And for him to shit on that whole idea, I think is really is kind of shitty of him.
Well, I mean, to me, that's the most reasonable, logical position to take.
It is the most reasonable and logical one because you can't know that God exists or know that God doesn't exist, at least in my opinion.
But they are still making a knowledge claim, only instead of making a claim about the non-existence of God, they're making a claim about the non-existence of evidence for God.
They're making a claim about the non-existence of evidence for God. We're not making a claim about the non-existence of the evidence of God.
Well, I mean, we're just saying y'all don't have no evidence.
Well, right, and he's saying, well, prove that. like that's some kind of argument against it, and it's not.
Prove that we have no evidence. You bring no evidence. There you go. I mean, I don't know what else to say about that.
Yeah.
Both are negative claims of identical form, and neither would carry any less of a burden of proof than the other. When the atheist asserts that there is no evidence for God and challenges you to convince him otherwise, he is appointing himself arbiter of all evidence.
No. No, we are not. And
Speak
yes,
for yourself. I'm an arbiter of evidence.
all evidence, though.
All the evidence.
All the evidences.
Hashtag all the evidences. Arbiter of all the evidences.
Nobody is claiming to be arbiter of all evidence. Like, we're arbiter of all evidence in that the evidence has to convince us. I mean, in that way we are, I guess, but it's not like we're some kind of authority. This seems to be like an argument from authority or something like that. I mean, it's just, it's ridiculous to say that, oh, well, you're saying that you're an authority on the evidence, and that's just that's a fallacy, which I think is where he's going with it.
When he refuses to be convinced by any evidence you provide, he will demand that you accept his starting premise as true.
I don't think any atheist demands a theist to state that, there is no evidence for God.
Well, the problem is that by default you're starting with the premise that there isn't a God. That's the default position.
Not for deflating atheism here. For deflating atheism, the default position is that God exists. So atheists have to prove that God does not exist.
But that's a presupposition. The default position is there isn't the default position is there isn't a God. That's the default. You make a claim that there is one, so you're required. It's not a presupposition.
Well, true, it's not. But what I feel like he's saying here is that because atheists aren't convinced by the current arguments for God's existence, he demands that you provide evidence, which you don't have to do. Like because God automatically exists.
I don't know. I have never seen you talk to a religious person, and you've talked to a lot of them, and I have never seen you talk to a religious person and make and demand that the religious person accept that there is no God before you start talking. I think that you would expect that they would have arguments. You would hope, not expect. You can't expect that they would have reasonable arguments, but you would hope that they would have reasonable arguments or have some sort of objective thinking, because all they're, you know what I'm saying? You would expect they would have some sort of objective thinking and not start with their premise automatically God is true.
Well, right. But they people like Deflating Atheism start with the presupposition that God exists.
This is not a position of intellectual humility. It's a position of ultimate intellectual arrogance.
It's intellectual arrogant to say that we don't know if a God exists or not, or to not be convinced by any of your current piss poor arguments. That's not intellectual arrogance. That's just being fucking intellectual.
It's intellectual honesty, to be more precise. I mean, I don't believe there's a God, but I'm not arrogant enough to say 100% for sure there isn't one. So I feel like that's intellectual honesty.
So it is necessary to recognize there is no evidence for God as a claim carrying a burden of proof, and to insist that the atheist either sustain the burden of proof for this claim or withdraw it.
Okay, so if he wants to play this particular game, that's fine. I mean, you have to give me evidences in order to tell you why they're not evidence. Like,
why they're unacceptable evidence.
Well, yeah, why it's unacceptable evidence. Like, see, that's how conversation works. I feel like this guy's so fucking remedial, he doesn't know how to have a conversation. Or he's just not wanting to have a conversation about the possibility of God not existing, and he just wants to continue in his own ignorance of, whether or not God exists.
He doesn't want to have the conversation, John, because he can't have the conversation. He can't have the conversation and win because their evidence doesn't hold up. It doesn't hold water. So, I mean, they don't want to have the conversation. They just want to be willfully ignorant.
They do. I mean, Deflating Atheism here, I would say, wants to be willfully ignorant. He doesn't want any evidence that's contrary to what he already believes. That's called cognitive dissonance. Dissonance. Saying that there is no evidence for God as a claim carrying the burden of proof. No, it doesn't. Sustain the burden of proof for this claim. So, like what I was saying before is that you would have to give me some kind of evidence to tell you why it is not acceptable evidence for God. So, like if you wanted to say the cosmological argument, or the first cause argument, I mean, those are easily shown to not actually prove that God exists. So therefore, it's not good evidence to suggest that God exists. There's an argument from design. That's not good because it's an equivocation fallacy, or it involves an equivocation fallacy. And so that is not a good piece of evidence to suggest that God exists. So if you want to play that game, fine, but you have to give me something to tell you why it's not an evidence for God, because otherwise you don't have evidence. That's just like what KC was saying, that the starting position is that there is no God. So if there is no God, then there is no evidence to suggest that one exists. You have to provide the evidence in order to invalidate that position so that we can replace it with a more accurate description of reality. That's called fucking science.
To assent to the premise that there is no evidence for God until the atheist is convinced otherwise is to assent to the premise that there is no evidence for God, full stop, as any atheist who would claim that there is no evidence for God has clearly already made up his mind and will refuse on principle to be convinced of any evidence for God.
Atheists aren't that hard-headed. I mean, every atheist that
Some are.
Some are? I mean, every atheist that I know, isn't that hard-headed. And I get that there could be some out there, or that there are some out there, but I don't know of any atheist that actively refuses on principle to be convinced of any evidence.
No, I think what he and a lot of people see is we seem dismissive of their arguments, and I would agree with that. I would agree that a lot of atheists seem incredibly dismissive of religious people's arguments for God. But there's a reason for that. They're not good evidence. And we've heard the same arguments over and over and over again. You bring us all the same arguments, all of the same evidence per se, right? What you think is evidence. And it's all been refuted, all of it. 1,000,000 times. You can easily Google everything that you're saying and see why it's not accurate. So that may be why you think that we're dismissive, is because you bring nothing new to the table. You bring the same old shit that's already been debunked or refuted. And so that's why we may seem dismissive at times.
Well, yeah. And I mean, as soon as you bring some kind of new line of logic or philosophical argument to the table, then fine, I will consider it. Just like, whenever I'm posed with, like the cosmological argument or the argument from design, like the first time that was brought to my attention, I actually looked into what the line of argument was, and then what the supposed refutation of it was. And, just because I'm convinced by the refutation, and the refutation makes more sense than the actual argument, doesn't mean that I'm refusing it on principle. That's just a straw man of how atheists act in general.
Now, when you hold the atheist's feet to the fire on this issue, you will typically encounter a handful of canned responses that are as stupid as they are predictable. Sometimes they'll try to rephrase their original claim into a seemingly more modest variant. Sometimes they'll use this variant to try to support their original claim. This doesn't help them at all.
The proof that there is no evidence for God is the fact that nobody ever in human history has provided compelling evidence for God. See, that's what I was saying before, and some people were getting kind of confused on, is that, it's the fact that no evidence has been provided. Like that.
Well, anything they bring, like when they come at us with the Bible, I'm sorry, no, that circular logic, bring me something else. And that may seem hard-headed and that may seem dismissive, but you can't prove that something in the Bible is true by using the Bible to prove it's true.
Well, I'm wondering here if he's using an equivocation fallacy, because if you think of it in a more broader sense, saying, a broader sense of the evidence for God, like when I say evidence for God, you could either think, well, there is no evidence for God. That's the sensible way to think. Or you could think about the multiple philosophical arguments and everything like that Christians feel are evidence for God.
Right, but again, feelings. Like, I feel God every day. Okay, well, that's not evidence.
Well, no. What I'm saying here is that he's confusing with, like, good evidence that absolutely proves God's existence with the existence of any kind of evidence, whether it's good or bad.
Oh, okay.
So I think that is what he's doing here, is he's actually confusing it to be, either to be like the evidence in general, not evidence that actually proves God, but just evidence in general. And they consider like the cosmological argument, fine-tuning, the argument from design, they consider them evidence for God, and saying that there is no evidence for God to them is an incorrect statement, because they have evidences for God. They're just not good evidence for God. They don't absolutely prove that God exists.
Right. It's not acceptable evidence.
I figured it out. I knew I'd figure this fuck out.
At best, they end up with another unproven claim. At worst, they end up with a circular argument or a non sequitur. Sometimes they'll misrepresent the situation and claim that you claimed God exists, and they're asking you for proof. This is nonsense. By asking the atheist for evidence, you're not even committing yourself to the position that God exists. An honest atheist could ask a fellow atheist why they think there's no evidence for God.
Well, true. If you're in a conversation with an atheist and you're on the opposite side of their argument, generally you're not an atheist.
But even if you and I were sitting here having a conversation and I asked you, why do you think there's no evidence for God? How do you respond?
Say that again. Sorry.
His question up on the screen. You and me are just sitting here talking. And I ask you, why do you think there's no evidence for God?
Because no line of logic or piece of evidence has actually been presented to me to convince me that a God exists. That's
so
how I'd answer that.
You've seen, or you've been provided with what a religious person would consider
evidence,
and you've looked into it and dismissed it because it doesn't hold up.
Right.
Okay, so how is that dishonest?
It's not dishonest. He's wanting to try to paint it as dishonest in order to try to get around actually having a discussion.
We're dealing with people who think a claim can be used to support itself, and who don't understand the difference between a question and a statement. So a debate about Thomistic philosophy probably isn't going to be very productive.
See, it's douchebag words like Thomistic that earn him his look there. I mean, he lives up to it completely. The very first part of this statement right here is talking about how the evidence that there's no evidence for God is that there's no evidence for God. Like, that's what he's talking about right here. And that we don't understand the difference between a question and a statement. No, we understand better than fucking you. And these two videos are the evidence for that.
In order to have even a hope of a successful discussion, the atheist must first be disarmed of the presumption of their claim. To this end, I've devised a little bit of Socratic reasoning you can use to preface any such discussions.
Oh, yay! Socratic reasoning in order to preface any of these discussions. Are you ready to get into a discussion there, Casey?
I'm ready, and I'm so glad we have this super smart theist guy explaining to us how common sense and logic works.
I'm giddy as fuck.
So the atheist says, enough of this jibber-jabber. Where is your evidence for God?
You're not saying it right there, man. You gotta throw a little bit of soul at it or something. It's like, enough of this jibber-jabber. Where's your evidence for God?
Well, you didn't do the ghosty sound.
oh yeah, I forgot. Enough of this jibber-jabber. Where is your evidence for God?
Yeah, see, that's how atheists talk.
Oh, yeah, I forgot.
Yeah.
And they always use this kind of patronizing language, your evidence for God, like they expect you to submit your little show and tell presentation.
I do expect you to submit your show and tell presentation. Like, if you're going to say there's a God, I do expect you to present evidence. Yes.
Say, first let me ask a question of you. Is it possible that there are some people who will refuse to be convinced by any amount of evidence?
Yeah. Okay, I'll agree.
Now, a quote-unquote skeptic is likely to respond yes to this due to his experiences dealing with anti-vaxxers and young earth creationists and the like.
He knew what we were going to say.
Yeah, no.
Therefore, the existence of evidence cannot depend on any one person being convinced, correct?
He means that the evidence exists regardless of whether or not you're convinced by it. Basically, the universe doesn't give a fuck, it just is. Like, the universe doesn't give a fuck what you believe.
Well, no, the universe doesn't give a fuck what you believe, but just because one person is convinced or not convinced does not make truth.
He responds in the affirmative. Therefore, the existence of evidence for God cannot depend on you being convinced, correct?
Okay, well, this is a straw man. He's presenting a straw man argument because nobody here, no atheist, is going to suppose that they are the ultimate authority on what consists of evidence. Like, the evidence that would convince somebody is different from, like, overall evidence. Like, if you're in a discussion, you're wanting to discuss ideas. And so just because he's convinced doesn't mean that it's not evidence for something. Because, I mean, you could turn it around and be like, because, you know, they reject all evidence for evolution being a thing. Just because they don't understand it or believe it doesn't mean that it doesn't actually happen. So, I mean, I get where he's coming from with this, but he's arguing it in a way that is meant to trip you up. I guess maybe a non sequitur kind of argument. I mean, he's framing this to trip you up in what you're talking about.
Bingo. I would be more than happy to engage in a good faith discussion about evidences for God.
That's what I asked for to begin with.
Well, yeah. I mean, this entire conversation that he supposes here is bullshit because it's not going to go down that way. Like, just because there exists, evidences out there for something or not for or against something, and regardless of whether or not it convinces a person means that it is or is not evidence. But I mean, if you're in a discussion with somebody and you're trying to convince them of something, the evidence has to be convincing for them. It just seems to me like he's looking for an easy way out of a discussion with somebody that disagrees with him.
So here's my experience in having conversations with religious people. I'm not trying to convince them of anything.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I spend most of the time asking questions and then trying to get them to think about why what they're responding with is not accurate or not enough. Like, that's what I do. I don't try to convince them of anything.
Well, doesn't it also seem to be a case of projection here?
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, you have Deflate over there smoking a cigarette looking sexy as fuck. You have Deflate over there that is trying to project this whole authoritative position. Like, he's trying to say that the atheist is claiming an authoritative position on evidence, while at the same time, he himself claims this authority on it. So, I mean, it's a case, I guess maybe a projection fallacy, because, I mean, he's projecting, like, his position on the atheists, trying to convince them that they are acting in an authoritative capacity.
Well, and they're the ones that are claiming authority. Like, they're saying, well, you can't possibly be, like, convincing you doesn't mean that you're right, or that, you know what I mean? Like, you being convinced doesn't make truth.
Right.
Well, right. But this, just turn that shit right back around and look in the mirror. Just because you're convinced by your evidence doesn't mean that your evidence is right.
Well, true.
But they want to, they're the authority. Like, they think they're the authority.
Right. And like I said, he's projecting his position onto atheists, and atheists just simply don't have conversations like this. Like, nobody has a conversation like this.
I've never had a conversation like this.
However, I reject the assumption that there is no evidence for God until you are convinced otherwise, and will refuse to engage in any discussion that begins with this assumption.
See, he's just looking to shut down conversation. That's all he wants to do, is shut down conversation. He doesn't actually want a conversation. He just wants to have a reason for not having the conversation, and he wants to blame it on you for not having the conversation.
Well, there's a lot of people out there that don't want to have a conversation, including atheists, as we've seen in...
Well, yeah, I'm not saying atheists are special, that they don't have, they don't have these follies. I'm just saying that he doesn't need to be sitting up on his high fucking horse over there acting like atheists are the ones that are wrong in this entire thing.
Well, yeah.
I hope you found these videos helpful. Please like and share, and be sure to subscribe to the Deflating Atheism YouTube channel and Facebook page.
Deflating Atheism Facebook page is linked above. I'm sure that he will be by here shortly in order to shit talk us into obscenity. Or absurdity. Sorry. I've been speaking obscenities.
You're the one, with obscenity.
Anyways, guys, I think I'm going to go. I really appreciate everybody. I will see you heathens later. Don't forget to stand up, use your voice, and don't ever run off of like 3 hours of sleep like I do sometimes. I'll see you heathens later. Y'all have a nice night.
Bye, y'all.